Hey there, welcome to Cozzii Traveler. Tonight, we're descending beneath one of the most visited museums on Earth, a place that holds paintings worth kingdoms, sculptures that defined beauty, and hallways that have seen more footsteps than the streets of Paris above. But hidden beneath the marble floors and glass pyramids is something older, something the world forgot, until a team of archaeologists cracked open the floor and found themselves standing inside a fortress no one had seen in nearly 800 years. This isn't just a story about art, it's a story about power, paranoia, and a royal secret buried for centuries, right under the Louvre. So dim the lights, pull your blanket a little closer, and get yourself comfortable. And before we head underground, take a second to subscribe and say hello to your fellow travelers tonight in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always wild to see how far these stories travel. Now, it's time to go to Paris. When most people picture the Louvre, they imagine the glass pyramid glittering in the Parisian sun, surrounded by fountains and crowds of visitors taking selfies. It's easy to forget that beneath that serene courtyard lies a different world, one made of stone, torchlight, and silence. In 1981, President François Mitterrand launched the Grand Louvre project, a massive renovation to modernize the museum. Architect Frère Impey was selected in 1983 to design the now famous glass pyramid, which would open to the public in 1989. The pyramid itself was controversial from the start. Parisians called it an eyesore, an insult to the Renaissance palace. There were protests, petitions, angry editorials. How dare they put a glass monument in front of France's most sacred cultural institution? But Mitterrand was determined. He wanted the Louvre to be more than a museum. He wanted it to be a symbol of France's future, bold and transparent. So construction began. And that's when everything changed. As workers began digging under the Cour Carrée, they found something strange. Layers of masonry that didn't match the Renaissance palace above. Thick walls of grey limestone, and passages that seemed to lead nowhere. At first, engineers thought they'd hit an old sewer system or forgotten wine cellar. But the stones were too large, too deliberate. These weren't utility tunnels, they were fortifications. What started as a construction site became an archaeological excavation, and what they uncovered would rewrite Parisian history. Long before the Louvre became a museum, before it became a royal palace even, it was a fortress, a military stronghold built by King Philip II Augustus at the end of the 12th century. At that time, Paris was far smaller, barely stretching beyond the Ile de la Cité. The entire city could fit inside a modern arrondissement. You could walk from one end to the other in less than an hour. Paris had a population of around 100 to 150,000 people, making it the largest city in Western Europe at the time. The Crusades were raging. England and France were locked in a centuries-long rivalry, and kings lived in constant fear of invasion. Philip II was not a romantic king. He didn't build monuments to beauty or faith. He built monuments to survival. When he left for the Third Crusade in 1190, he worried constantly about leaving Paris undefended. His advisors told him the city walls were strong enough, but Philip didn't believe them. He'd seen what happened to unprotected cities in the Holy Land. They burned. And Paris had memories of the Viking siege centuries earlier. So before he left, Philip ordered the construction of two things: a massive stone wall encircling Paris, and a fortress on the western edge of the city guarding the Seine River. The name of that fortress? Le Louvre. Its exact meaning is debated. Some say it comes from lewa, an old Frankish word for fortress or watchtower. Others think it derived from the Latin word lupus, meaning wolf, or from lupara, suggesting wolves may have roamed the area. Another theory links it to Louvre, the name of the area where it was built. The true origin remains uncertain. The original Louvre wasn't the graceful palace we know today. It was dark, practical, and formidable, with a water-filled outer moat fed from the Seine, a drawbridge, and towers thicker than any church wall in Paris. At its centre stood the Great Keep, the Grosse Tour du Louvre, a massive round tower. The keep had a diameter of 15.6 metres, stood 30 metres tall, and had walls 4.25 metres thick at its base. It was surrounded by its own dry moat, a paved ditch 9 metres wide and 6 metres deep, lined with large irregular stones. The fortress itself was nearly square in plan, 78 metres by 72 metres, and enclosed by walls 2.6 metres thick. 10 round defensive towers dotted the walls, one at each corner, one at the centre of the northern and western sides, and twin towers flanking the narrow gates on the southern and eastern sides. Construction took nearly a decade. Thousands of labourers quarried limestone from the hills outside Paris, hauled it by cart and barge, and stacked it stone by stone into walls that could withstand siege engines. The fortress was likely completed around 1200, though construction continued into the early years of the 13th century. When Philip II returned from the Crusades in late 1191, work on his great fortress was well underway, a stone colossus rising to guard the Seine. For over a century the fortress stood guard over Paris, and then, like many relics of the medieval world, it began to change. By the time of Charles V in the 14th century, Paris was expanding. By 1364, new city walls had been built farther out, and the Louvre no longer sat at the frontier. Its days as a defensive stronghold were ending, but its story was far from over. Charles V was different from his predecessors. He was scholarly, intellectual, and obsessed with books. He'd survived a chaotic childhood. His father, King John II, had been captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers and held for ransom. Charles had to rule France as regent while still in his teens, dealing with peasant revolts and constant threats. When he finally became king in 1364, he wanted something more than violence. He wanted beauty. Around 1365, Charles V moved the royal residence from the Ile de la Cité to the Louvre and began transforming the old fortress into a royal palace. He hired the architect Raymond du Temple to redesign the interiors. He filled the halls with tapestries from Flanders, furniture from Italy, and books, thousands of books. His library became one of the largest in Europe, with 973 precious manuscripts on philosophy, astronomy, theology, and poetry. He set up this collection in the highest tower, forming the basis of what would eventually become the National Library of France. He turned cold stone chambers into warm salons of art and intellect, a symbol of France's growing sophistication. But the massive keep still loomed in the centre of the courtyard, dark, damp, and completely out of place in the elegant new palace. Charles considered tearing it down, but never did. He died in 1380, and the keep remained. Then came Francis I. Francis I was everything Charles V was not. Bold, extravagant, and obsessed with grandeur. When he ascended the throne in 1515, he looked at the Louvre and saw a relic. Medieval architecture was out of fashion. The Renaissance had arrived from Italy, bringing with it a love of symmetry, light, and classical beauty. In 1528, Francis I decided to make the Louvre his principal residence. He wanted a palace that reflected his vision of France as the centre of European culture. So he brought in the finest architects, including Pierre Lescot, who would design the Louvre's iconic western wing. But there was a problem. The old keep stood in the way. So Francis made a decision that would echo for centuries. Beginning in 1528, he ordered the great keep demolished. The demolition took years. The walls were so thick that workers had to use wedges, hammers, and controlled fires to crack the stone. Piece by piece, they dismantled the tower that had guarded Paris for over 300 years. The stones were hauled away and reused in other construction projects around the city. Some ended up in churches, some in bridges. Some disappeared entirely. By the mid-1600s, the keep was gone, erased from the landscape. For the next several centuries, the fortress disappeared from memory. Its underground parts were simply backfilled, its tunnels sealed, and its moat filled with earth. Generations passed without anyone realizing they were walking above the bones of the medieval Louvre. Until, that is, the 20th century dug it back up. It was the early 1980s. Paris was humming with construction, cranes, concrete, and the promise of progress. But inside the Louvre site, things were different. Workers kept hitting ancient foundations, walls that didn't line up with any known palace plans. So archaeologists were brought in. Between late 1983 and late 1985, a major excavation campaign was conducted in the Cour Carrée, under the direction of archaeologist Michel Fleury. They began carefully removing layers of soil, inch by inch, and as they dug deeper, the outlines of a circular tower emerged, the base of Philip II's Great Keep. Imagine being one of those archaeologists, brushing away centuries of dirt and realizing that you're standing inside the first Louvre, not the Palace of Kings, not the Museum of Masterpieces, but the fortress that made both possible. They uncovered thick curtain walls, arrow slits for archers, the moat where guards once patrolled, and the foundations of the keep itself, a perfect circle. The discovery was breathtaking, not just for historians, but for Parisians, who suddenly realized the ground beneath their city held an entire lost world. The excavation revealed hundreds of everyday life objects. They found fragments of pottery, coins from the reign of Philip II, and pieces of weaponry, arrowheads, broken sword hilts, and other medieval artifacts. They uncovered the stone support of the drawbridge at the main gate, plus abundant masons' marks carved on the blocks by the medieval stonemasons. One particularly remarkable find was the Chapel of Charles VI, a parade helmet decorated with fleur-de-lis that had been inventoried in 1411. It was found broken into innumerable pieces in the keep's well. Each stonemason had a unique symbol, a kind of medieval signature that allowed foremen to track who built which section. These marks served both as quality control and as a form of advertisement for the masons' work. The Ministry of Culture quickly decided that these ruins had to be preserved. The museum plans were redrawn, and today, when you enter the Louvre through the underground carousel entrance, you can still walk through that medieval fortress. Stone walls that have survived 8 centuries, still standing where kings once planned wars. The excavation revealed more than just walls. It revealed secrets. Historians found traces of a sophisticated drainage system, evidence of iron grates and bridges, even fragments of old ceramics and armor. Every piece told a story about life in 12th century Paris, a world of knights, sieges, and royal intrigue. They also found graffiti and occasional inscriptions scratched into the walls by guards, prisoners, or visitors over the centuries, traces of the people who lived and worked within these walls. But the most haunting discovery wasn't an object, it was the atmosphere. Inside those stone corridors, the air feels different, cool and heavy. Visitors often describe a strange sensation down there, like stepping out of time. These walls were witnesses to history. They saw the founding of France's power, the birth of Paris as a capital, and the transformation of a kingdom into an empire of culture. They saw Philip II return from the Crusades. They saw Charles V transform the fortress into a palace. They saw the royal treasury guarded in the vaults. They saw Francis I make the decision to tear the keep down. And now, centuries later, they're still standing, silent, patient, waiting for anyone who cares to listen. The Louvre's evolution mirrors France itself, from fortress to palace to museum. After Francis I demolished the keep, his successors continued to expand and beautify the palace. Catherine de' Medici added the Tuileries garden. Henry IV built the Grande Galerie along the Seine, connecting the Louvre to the Tuileries Palace. He completed this in 1610. Louis XIII and Louis XIV added monumental courtyards and facades, including the Apollo Gallery. But then Louis XIV made a decision that would change the Louvre's fate forever. In 1682, he moved the royal court to Versailles, a brand new palace built in the countryside, far from the noise and danger of Paris. The Louvre was largely abandoned as a royal residence. Not demolished, but left without its primary purpose, a palace without a king. For decades, it sat in a state of limbo. Artists set up studios in forgotten rooms. Various royal workers and their families lived there. Parts of it housed art collections, but there was no unified purpose. It wasn't until the French Revolution that the Louvre found a new purpose. In 1793, the revolutionary government declared that the Louvre would become a public museum, the Musée Central des Arts, later renamed the Museum of the French Republic. For the first time in history, ordinary people could walk through the halls where kings once lived and see the art that had been hidden in royal collections for centuries. The transformation was radical. The museum displayed art that had previously been held in the royal collection, embodying the Enlightenment ideals that had ignited the French Revolution. It was revolutionary in every sense. Napoleon Bonaparte expanded the museum dramatically, bringing back treasures from across Europe during his campaigns. He renamed it the Musée Napoléon and filled it with art from Italy, Egypt, and beyond. His expeditions, particularly the 1798 trip to Egypt, brought back thousands of artifacts that formed the basis of the museum's Egyptian collection. When Napoleon fell in 1815, the Europeans came to reclaim their stolen art. Thousands of works were returned to their countries of origin, but not everything went back. Some pieces had been acquired legitimately through purchases or donations. Others France simply retained. So the Louvre kept much of its collection and continued to grow through donations, archaeological expeditions, and new acquisitions throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But beneath the marble and the masterpieces, the fortress endured, patiently waiting, buried under centuries of ambition. When archaeologists rediscovered it in the 1980s, they didn't just find ruins, they found continuity, a reminder that even the most modern places are layered upon the past. Today, as you walk through the medieval foundations, you can trace that journey with your fingertips. The rough limestone that once guarded the Seine, the carved grooves where drawbridge chains once passed, and the circular outline of a tower that no longer exists but refuses to be forgotten. The Louvre's hidden fortress is just one chapter in a much larger story, the story of Paris beneath Paris. The city is built like a millefeuille, a pastry of history, one layer on top of another. Beneath its streets lie crypts, catacombs, Roman baths, and medieval cellars. Beneath Notre Dame, archaeologists discovered remnants of Gallo-Roman structures from when Paris was still called Lutetia. The city had been a Roman settlement, and traces of that ancient past still exist underground in the archaeological crypt. Beneath the Place de la Bastille, traces of the original fortress prison still remain. The prison where revolutionaries stormed on July 14, 1789, marking the beginning of the French Revolution. You can still see fragments of its walls in the Bastille metro station and at nearby square Henri Galli. Beneath the Opera Garnier, there's an underground reservoir, a large cistern created during construction in the 1860s. Fed by underground water, it inspired Gaston Leroux's Phantom of the Opera. Paris is a city built on secrets, and the Louvre fortress might be the most important secret of all, because it represents the beginning, the moment when Paris became more than a collection of villages, the moment it became a capital worth defending. It's easy to forget that cities don't just grow upward, they grow downward too. Every century builds on the bones of the one before it. When you stand in the Louvre's medieval hall today, you're not just looking at history, you're standing inside it. One of the most fascinating parts of the Louvre's early history is its builder, King Philip II Augustus. He was not a romantic king, he was a strategist, calculating, pragmatic, and ruthlessly efficient. Philip's life was defined by survival. He became king at age 15 in 1180, inheriting a kingdom surrounded by enemies. England controlled much of western France through the Angevin Empire. His own nobles were constantly scheming. When he joined the Third Crusade in 1190, it wasn't purely out of religious fervour, it was also politics. The Crusades were where kings proved their legitimacy and earned respect. But the Crusade tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Philip and Richard, the Lionheart of England, met at Vézelay on July 4, 1190, and set out together for the Holy Land. But the two men had a complicated history. Richard had previously been Philip's ally against Richard's own father, Henry II. But now Richard was King of England, and far wealthier and more powerful than Philip. The two kings travelled together at first, but separated at Lyon. They reunited in Sicily, where tensions grew. Philip hired a Genoese fleet and reached the Holy Land first, arriving at Acre on April 20th, 1191. Richard arrived at Acre on June 8, 1191, and the siege intensified. By the time Acre surrendered on July 12th, Philip was severely ill with dysentery. The illness reduced his enthusiasm for the crusade. Relations with Richard deteriorated further after Richard broke his betrothal to Philip's sister Alice, choosing instead to marry Berengaria of Navarre. This was both a personal slight and a political problem, as Alice's dowry included territory that Philip wanted returned. On July 31st, 1191, Philip left the crusade and returned to France, officially to settle succession disputes, but also because of his illness and frustration with Richard. When he returned to France in late 1191, Philip II had learned a hard lesson about the risks of leaving his kingdom undefended. While he was away, things had become unstable, so he focused on fortifying his realm. He had already built the stone wall around Paris before leaving for the crusade. The Louvre fortress was part of that defensive network, not as a home, but as an anchor, a symbol of permanence in a world of chaos. The Louvre was his insurance policy. If enemies came, the king could retreat there. If the city was besieged, the fortress could hold out. But here's the irony. Philip rarely stayed there. He preferred his palace on the Ile de la Cité. The Louvre was too military, too cold, too functional. Instead, Philip used the fortress for storage and security. By the late 13th century, the royal treasury was housed at the Louvre, and it continued to serve financial and archival roles in subsequent reigns. The fortress held chests of gold, silver, and jewels locked in. The vaults, along with legal documents, treaties, and records of land ownership. And he kept prisoners there. The Louvre's dungeons held enemies of the crown, rebellious nobles, captured knights, and anyone who challenged royal authority. Philip II died in 1223, never having lived in the fortress he built, but his legacy remained, a stone monument to power and strategic thinking, and yet, centuries later, that same fortress would become a temple to art and beauty, the very opposite of what it was built for. It's a poetic irony. A building made to keep people out is now one that welcomes the entire world in. One of the most intriguing aspects of the medieval Louvre was its role as a royal stronghold for the kingdom's most valuable possessions. Deep within the fortress, in vaults protected by iron doors and armed guards, French kings stored the wealth and symbols of the realm. The treasury held gold, silver, and jewels, the liquid wealth needed to run a kingdom, pay armies, and finance wars. But it also contained items of immense symbolic value, regalia and relics that legitimized royal power and demonstrated God's favor toward France. Medieval treasuries commonly held religious relics believed to be fragments of sacred objects or bones of saints. Possessing such items gave kings legitimacy and were displayed on important occasions to impress foreign dignitaries and reinforce divine authority. The fortress also housed critical documents, the legal records and treaties that define the kingdom's boundaries and relationships. The treasury's survival depended on the keep's strength. Made of thick stone, it couldn't burn easily, protecting the realm's most valuable possessions, even when wooden structures around it might be damaged. Centuries later, when archaeologists excavated the fortress foundations, they found evidence of the fortress's long service as a royal stronghold, though the treasures themselves had long since been moved to other locations or lost to history. The empty vaults and passages still testify to the fortress's crucial role in protecting not just Paris, but the very authority and wealth of the French crown. When I. M. Pei's glass pyramid was unveiled in 1989, the controversy was immediate and intense. Critics called it an insult to French heritage. How could you put a modern glass structure in front of a Renaissance palace? Parisians protested. Newspapers ran angry editorials. But François Mitterrand defended it fiercely. He saw the pyramid as a symbol of transparency, literally and figuratively. The glass allowed light into the underground entrance hall, creating the Hall Napoleon, which provided access to the museum's wings and to the medieval remains preserved nearby in the Sully basement. It was a bridge between past and present, and over time, Parisians came to love it. Today, the pyramid is as iconic as the Eiffel Tower, which, ironically, faced similar criticism when it was first built. It's impossible to imagine the Louvre without it now. But what's often forgotten is how the pyramid made the discovery of the medieval fortress possible. Without the Grand Louvre renovation project initiated in 1981, the excavation would never have happened. The fortress would still be buried, forgotten, slowly deteriorating under the weight of the palace above. The construction work forced archaeologists to dig, and in digging they found the medieval Louvre. Pei's pyramids saved the medieval fortress by bringing it back to light. In that way, the pyramid and the fortress are partners, separated by 8 centuries but united in purpose. Both were built to protect something valuable. For Philip II, it was the Kingdom of France. For François Mitterrand, it was French culture. And visiting the Louvre today, you can experience both. The modern pyramid welcomes millions, while just below the ancient stones remind us where it all began. It's breathtaking. When the excavation was finally completed in the late 1980s and the Grand Louvre project opened to the public in 1989, visitors could for the first time walk through the newly uncovered fortress. The opening was a significant cultural event. Thousands came, artists, historians, schoolchildren, tourists, all wandering through corridors that hadn't been accessible in centuries. Major French newspapers covered the discovery extensively. The themes of time travel and hidden history dominated the coverage. The fortress beneath our feet, walking through time. For many Parisians, it was a revelation. They'd lived their entire lives in the city without knowing that beneath the Louvre, the symbol of French culture, lay the skeleton of medieval military power. The experience was transformative for many visitors. You can stand in front of the Great Keep's foundation, a circular wall of stone so thick it feels immovable, and realize this was once the literal center of royal power. From that spot, kings stored their wealth, armies were coordinated, and the security of France was maintained. And now, the same space echoes with the soft footsteps of visitors from around the world. People whispering, taking photos, trying to capture the feeling of standing between centuries. The Louvre installed subtle lighting to preserve the medieval atmosphere. Soft, warm lights that mimic torchlight, casting long shadows on the ancient stone. They also added explanatory plaques, but kept them minimal. The goal was to let the space speak for itself. The approach was intentional, not to turn it into a theme park, but to let people feel the weight of history, the reality of this place. Just the stones, the foundations, and the silence. That's what the Louvre does best. It collapses time. It lets you step into the 12th century, then climb a few stairs and face the Mona Lisa, one building containing the story of an entire civilization. Paris is a city that never stops rewriting itself. From medieval moats to glass pyramids, it has always balanced the old with the new. And the Louvre, perhaps more than any other place, embodies that tension. Every renovation reveals another layer, another mystery. Historical records suggest there may be undiscovered features sealed beneath various parts of the palace complex. Some documents mention storage areas and passages that were never fully mapped. Occasional discoveries during maintenance work have revealed additional medieval features, reminding archaeologists that more may still lie hidden. The challenge is that excavating further would be extremely difficult. It would require disrupting parts of the existing galleries, potentially closing sections of the museum, and risking damage to priceless art housed above. So for now, any remaining secrets stay buried. Maybe they'll be uncovered during future renovation projects. Maybe some mysteries will stay hidden forever. Because that's the truth of cities like Paris. They never stop changing. And the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when least expected. The Louvre is a living monument. It breathes, shifts, and evolves. Every generation adds something new while revealing something old. And in a way, that's fitting. Because the fortress beneath the Louvre was never meant to be a museum piece. It was meant to be functional, adaptive, and enduring. It succeeded beyond Philip II's wildest dreams. Not because it repelled invaders, though it served that purpose, but because it became part of the city's DNA, a foundation upon which everything else was built. There are legends about the Louvre fortress, stories that circulate but are never officially confirmed. One of the most persistent is the legend of the ghost of the Louvre, a mysterious figure said to haunt the underground galleries and medieval passages. According to local law, late at night, after the museum closes and the tourists leave, strange sounds echo from the medieval halls. Footsteps on stone, the creak of heavy doors, whispers in Old French. Are these stories true? Most dismiss them as wind in the ventilation system or the natural settling of ancient stone. The sounds could be explained by the building's infrastructure, by water pipes, by the modern museum's heating and cooling systems. But stories persist. Whether you believe in such things or not, there's something undeniably atmospheric about standing in a place where so much history unfolded, where prisoners were held in dark dungeons, where treasures worth kingdoms were hidden, where kings made decisions that changed the course of nations. The stones absorbed centuries of human drama. And now, in the silence of the underground halls, the mind can wander to all that happened here. Historians and philosophers have noted something interesting about buildings like this. They're not passive containers for human activity. They're shaped by the people who use them, and in turn, they shape the people who come after. The Louvre fortress is a monument to power, but also to transformation. It reminds us that nothing is permanent, not even the things we build to last forever. And that's the real fascination of the medieval Louvre. It's not just a ruin, it's a story that's still being written. Every visitor who walks through those halls adds something: their presence, their wonder, their connection to a past they never experienced but somehow understand. Because history isn't just about dates and names, it's about continuity. It's about standing in the same spot where someone stood 800 years ago and realizing you're part of the same story. Today, the medieval Louvre is one of the museum's most beloved spaces. Visitors descend the escalators beneath the pyramid, pass through the modern entrance hall, and suddenly find themselves standing in front of walls that were built in the late 12th century. The transition is striking. One moment you're surrounded by glass and steel, the next you're in a stone corridor that carries the weight of centuries. The ruins are beautifully preserved. The circular foundation of the Great Keep dominates the space, a massive ring of stone that visitors can walk around. You can walk through the medieval moat, imagining it filled with water, guards patrolling above. Information panels explain the fortress's history, but they're discreet. The focus is on the space itself. Many visitors are surprised to find this medieval section. They come for the art and stumble upon something far older. The medieval Louvre offers something different from the galleries upstairs. Unlike the paintings and sculptures, which are displayed in carefully controlled environments behind barriers and glass, the fortress feels immediate, accessible, real. You can touch the walls. You can walk where medieval guards once patrolled. You can stand in what used to be the moat. This direct physical connection to the past resonates with people in a way that viewing art sometimes doesn't. It's not just seeing history, it's inhabiting it. The medieval foundations remind visitors that the grand palace above, with its masterpieces and marble halls, was built on a foundation of stone and strategic thinking, and it invites us to imagine what else lies buried beneath our feet, what other stories are waiting to be discovered, not just in Paris, but in cities around the world. So the next time you walk through the Louvre, past the crowds, past the glass pyramid, past the masterpieces everyone came to see, take a moment to go downstairs. Walk into the cool air of the medieval foundations. Run your hand along the rough stone, the same stone that Philip II's masons laid 800 years ago. Stand in the circular foundation of the Great Keep and imagine what it looked like. A tower 30 meters tall, rising above the Seine, watching over a city that was just beginning to become the Paris we know today. And remember that beneath every work of art, there's a story of survival, of kings and walls and people who built something meant to last forever. The fortress beneath the Louvre isn't just a ruin, it's a heartbeat, the first pulse of a city that became the soul of France. It's the reminder that Paris, for all its beauty, was forged in stone and struggle, and that everything we build, no matter how grand, is built on the bones of what came before.